Hi, I'm Karen Elliott, and you're listening to the District B-Sides podcast, where you'll hear in-depth conversations with council, staff, and community members to take you behind the decisions that are being made on topics that matter to Squamish. Now let's tune in and join the conversation.
Welcome to the District B-Sides podcast. I'm your host, Matt Gunn, and you're listening to part 3 of a series that explores the relationship between density and livability and how an increased housing supply can create affordability, equity, and connectivity in our community. Today, I'm joined by District of Squamish Mayor Karen Elliott to discuss some of the perceptions we hear about density in our community. Let's get to the conversation. Let's begin by discussing some of the things we've heard so far in this podcast series. Sarah Ellis, City of Vancouver housing planner, was our first guest. What are some of the takeaways that you got from Sarah Ellis's conversation?
Well, I think one of the big takeaways for me was that she actually represents a voice that we often don't hear from very often when we get into public hearings around density or that sort of thing. You know, the idea that there's benefits to adding density to a community. And also, what I loved about her discussion was this idea of what we risk losing if we don't introduce different forms of housing and cater to a wide variety of needs in the community across all stages of life. And maybe you picked up on this too, was this idea of potentially losing a sense of neighborhood in her comments about things disappearing from neighborhoods when you don't have a diversity of housing or the right level of density.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I took away related to that was that there is change happening. I think often people feel like they like where they live, they want to maintain the character and have things stay as they are. And I think what she pointed out was that from her kind of experience in the city of Vancouver and seeing how Vancouver's changed, that because there's so much demand for housing, the prices are being pushed up really quickly. And so that actually creates a whole series of changes. And so this idea that you can hold your neighborhood as it is isn't really real. The price escalation changes the dynamic and the character, and that can lead to a loss of diversity, a loss of ability for families to move in. It can really change the neighborhood. And I think what she gave me was the sense that you have to take action to try and address some of those challenges or address that changing nature from price increases, and that adding density can help address some of that by creating spaces that a variety of people can live in.
Yeah, and I think she's right. And so I know for a lot of people, the word density is a scary word, or that it looks like high-rise buildings or condos. And I think hopefully through this podcast series and through our conversation today, people are understanding that density means a number of different things. But to me, at the heart of it is that people can choose which neighborhood they want to live in at any stage of their life. And so there's a diversity of housing forms that are present in each of our major neighborhoods that you might need when you first graduate from post-secondary, or you just got married, or now you've started a family, or now you're retired and your kids have left home, but you don't want to leave the neighborhood that you've lived in for 20 years. So how do we accomplish that? And I think that was really important part of what Sarah had to say.
Absolutely. And I think her perspective from the city of Vancouver was great to bring here. And the fact that she was just coming to Squamish and a new resident it was a great conversation. I found that was really helpful. The second conversation we had in the podcast series was with Bronson Bullivant, BC transit planner. Some of the elements of his conversation that really struck me were about the key elements that were really necessary to make transit successful in a community. He specifically talked about how a population of 3,500 people or jobs per square kilometer within 400 meters of transit stops along a core transit network would allow that transit network to be operated at a 15-minute frequency. And from a transit perspective, that 15-minute frequency was really important to make transit appealing to use because it was reliable. People would know that if they walked out to a transit stop, they wouldn't be waiting for 45 minutes, that they could just go out there and eventually it would come within a time frame that was acceptable. And so that I think that idea that transit, which ties into a bunch of our official community plan goals, that we want to have options that aren't just single occupant vehicles. The fact that density can support that and make that more viable, more appealing, was a really big takeaway for me from that conversation, and something that we've been thinking about and trying to work towards to have that successful transit system, and the relationship to density is really key to that.
And this is really interesting. And I also sit on the board of BC Transit. So now I'm hearing about transit systems all over the province, not just our own. But I think oftentimes people don't make that connection between a useful, reliable, convenient transit system and the number of people that live in close proximity to those routes. And I hope that's something that our community can really start to understand and embody. I think when you ask people why they don't take the bus, it's because it's not convenient. And if you're like me and live in kind of this just-in-time calendar shuffle where I'm always sort of rushing to get to work, to get to kids, to get back home, if I'm going to take transit, I have to know that it'll come. And if I miss a bus, and hopefully you don't, because we have the Next Ride app and you can see exactly where the bus is on the route. But if I do, that 15 minutes isn't that far away. But to get there, I need more people living along that bus route, because people also say to me, please keep my taxes low, which means I need more taxpayers within 400 meters of stops along that route so that I can afford to provide to this community 15-minute transit service. And I don't think that relationship is often front of mind for people. It costs a lot to run buses all day long at 15-minute intervals. So if we put, a little bit more density around our core transit network in a way that fits with each neighborhood, I think we can achieve some not only neighborhood and community building goals, but also better transit and better results for our community climate action plan.
Absolutely. Okay, I'd like to shift now from the kind of the conversations we've had in the podcast series to conversations and discussions that we hear around town. And there's been a few different pieces that are informing this. We have the 2020 zoning bylaw update. There's been some projects there as we're implementing our 2040 official community plan. We've had a couple mayors drop-ins focused on single-family neighborhoods. And then there's been the ongoing discussion over a number of years around development that's occurring in our community. And in these conversations, we hear a bunch of different opinions and concerns kind of over and over again around density. And I think it'd be worth taking a bit of time to unpack a few of those. The first one I want to start with is infrastructure. One of the things that we hear often is that there's a concern that our infrastructure can't handle the increased density, or that the higher density associated with multifamily in some of our existing neighborhoods would be too expensive to maintain. What's your perception on the relationship between density and servicing infrastructure?
Yeah, you're right, Matt. This is something that comes up. We hear it sometimes at public hearings or in emails that people send to us. So, one of the key things to keep in mind for folks is that we have master plans for pretty much every piece of infrastructure that is under the ground at the district, whether it's water, sewer, wastewater, stormwater. We have a plan, and we have a plan for how it grows with our community. So that part to me is taken care of. We understand what it's going to take from an infrastructure perspective to get to the 2040. Where I think the disconnect happens is people not understanding who pays for what when. So when someone comes along and rezones a piece of property for a larger development, they do pay development cost charges, which go to support our growth projects for roads and water and sewer. And they're also often responsible for upgrading the infrastructure along their road frontage to meet the demands of their development. Um, but I know we get questions about this sort of thing, and maybe you can shed some light on how our engineers look at it, because you work really closely with them. So to me, higher density means that we can actually keep taxes lower and better sustain our infrastructure. But maybe you can talk about it from the planners and engineers perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the work that we completed on the official community plan, one of the things that we wanted to look at was the kind of pieces of information we'd look at during sub-area planning or neighborhood planning. If we're looking at a neighborhood, how do we envision what the best outcome is of this area over time? And one of the variables in our minds was, how do we keep the servicing costs as low as possible, the ongoing costs that will drive taxes? And in my mind, one of the pieces there is, what are the number of taxpayers to the servicing infrastructure in the ground? What's that ratio that would be ideal? And so I wanted to go to engineering and say, hey, can you guys give us a way to understand the optimal density in a community to keep our taxes low? Thinking that there might be this break-even point or this breaking point where all of a sudden, if you had this target density, if you had that number of people in a neighborhood, you'd get the lowest prices for infrastructure over time. But the interesting thing was, when I approached our manager of infrastructure, David Rolston, about those target densities and how we might be able to determine them, he actually said that, really, it's not that there's a target density. The more density you have on an existing piece of infrastructure, the lower the per person costs. The big cost to us in managing infrastructure over the long term is replacement of infrastructure. All those pipes eventually need to be dug up, pulled out, and replaced with new pipes. And the big costs there are all the effort to get the pipe out of the ground and put the new one in. The actual cost of the pipe, if you're comparing a 6-inch pipe versus a 10-inch pipe, that cost is quite minimal in the overall scheme. And so having bigger pipes in there to serve more people in the same amount of area isn't a big increase in cost. And so his point was, increased density reduces your infrastructure costs over time. And so multifamily, like townhouses or apartments, those are the types of housing that will keep those infrastructure costs low over time. And so I think sometimes I hear in some of these public hearings, people saying, oh, if you put in those apartments, you're going to overwhelm our infrastructure. And the reality is that those types of developments are probably going to end up subsidizing the lower density single family neighborhoods, because they are effectively covering the cost of their infrastructure servicing over time.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And, I think there's at rezoning trying to make sure that growth pays for growth, right? So that there's sufficient development cost charges in place, that there's community amenity contributions that make sense, and that any upgrades that need to happen for a development to take place are paid for by the developer at that time. And we're also trying to make sure that the fees and charges aren't so high that we're having a really negative effect on housing affordability. And so that's the piece for a council, when we set those policies around DCCs or community amenity contributions, that we're being mindful that this gets passed on to the eventual homeowner. But over time, as you say, putting those people there helps reduce the maintenance cost and the replacement costs over time, because we're spreading, whatever, that 100 meters of pipe over more taxpayers. So there's definitely a benefit to that in my mind. And I want people to know that we are planning for the growth. It's not that we will find ourselves in a situation that infrastructure gets overwhelmed by the addition of people.
Absolutely. Another common concern related to density that we hear in some of these conversations is that bringing in the density is going to consume our environmental or recreational assets. And again, I can see where this concern comes from during the engagement that we completed with our official community plan process. Two of the things that came out loud and clear were that people in Squamish really value the environment and they really value recreational activities and the infrastructure, the trail network, the places to go that we use for those. And so, I think one of the things that's really important to keep in mind when we're talking about some of these developments as they relate to density is that we're not talking about development projects on undeveloped public lands. We're talking about private lands, often that have zoning for some type of development already. And I think some of the perception that, allowing density is going to remove these environmental values or recreational values isn't really accurate, because what we're talking about is areas that might become single family neighborhoods. And if you were to look at the amount of land that gets consumed by a single family development as opposed to a multifamily development, it's really significant in those single family developments. With multifamily, we can take the number of dwelling units and use a smaller amount of area for a number of housing units that can make the project profitable, but also can maintain some of the area around for environmental values or for recreational assets like trails and green space. So I think sometimes that the perception doesn't quite match the reality, where we can really use that density in the multifamily development to preserve more of these environmental and recreational values.
It's a great point, Matt. And we know from emerging climate science that biodiversity is at risk. And so people don't want us to cut down forests to just put in homes. So to me, that's one of the reasons, taking that feedback we heard from the official community plan engagement and putting in section 9 of the OCP, this idea of growth management principles. And they're there for the community to read. And people should. And it really was to put a growth management boundary around Squamish. When I first arrived in Squamish, it doesn't take you long to realize that this community sprawled early and far, very quickly. Like, there's a great distance to travel from Valley Cliff all the way to the end of Brackendale. So that's a lot of infrastructure to support and maintain, and roads. And so we're not a very dense community, and most of the homes, I think you told me this, like 46% of our stock is single family,
Yep.
which is high compared to our neighbors in the corridor. So we put in the growth management boundary because if you look within that, we can actually develop on the lands within that boundary up to a population of almost, I think it was 34,000 people, without spreading into the forest stands that are still standing out there. And I think that's incredibly important. One, from a tax perspective, that again, we're putting a few more people inside the area, the footprint we already live on, to help us pay to maintain and replace infrastructure over time. And two, that we're not sprawling into the recreational areas that we love before we absolutely need to. And I get that there's this really important balance between creating opportunities for builders in our community and the construction industry. But I think that can happen within the areas that are still available for growth. And there's still some large parcels of land here that are going to get developed, that are within the growth management boundaries. So to me, it strikes the right balance between saying, hey, let's grow within our current footprint for the time being, and help lower the costs of infrastructure for everyone over time. And then let's put in place some really good policies so that when we do need to expand beyond that growth management boundary, we're ready to do it with smart policy. And whether that's the wildfire DPA or the steep slopes, because as soon as we go outside that growth management boundary, those are some big risks that we have. So to me, it gives us a bit of time to think about neighborhood development, think about the type of infrastructure, allow innovation around climate to catch up to where we want to go in terms of building neighborhoods of the future, develop our transit system a little bit better within our current footprint, get it to that 15-minute interval to make it convenient. So I think there's so much wonderful opportunity within our current footprint without taking away from the quality of life of our current citizens or those who will join us. over the coming years. That to me is really important. And I think our community told us that in the official community plan engagement we did.
Yeah, they certainly did. Speaking of how expectations people have for having a good lifestyle and a good neighborhood, one of the things that comes up over and over again when we're talking about density or development in existing neighborhoods is concern around traffic. A lot of that's a comment that a lot of people make, that they're concerned that as new developments come in, especially into single family neighborhoods, that the increased density is going to lead to difficulty getting around the roads in their neighborhood. And really, we're talking about a transportation issue when we're getting into that traffic. And, linking back to what we heard from Bronson at BC Transit, transportation and density are really connected. And particularly when we start thinking about transit, one of the things in our official community plan that came out was that we were really looking for ways to promote alternatives to single occupant vehicles. We want active transportation, we want transit options, and we want those to be more convenient, as Bronson said, as we talked about earlier, so that people can get from the places they live to the places they work. And there's a bunch of benefits to that. It's a healthier way to live in terms of having active transportation. It's better for our climate goals. But another piece is that, right now we kind of have this expectation that at any time we can jump in a car and drive to wherever we want to go, whether it be the store or work, and park our car and go do whatever we've gone there to do. But that does lead to some parking issues. We have a lot of cars that then need to be stored during the day in all these different locations. And, in a town like ours where we've got a constrained land base, as a planner, when I'm thinking about how we use land, I really am trying to make sure that we have land available for people to live at, so affordable housing or various forms of housing, or that we can use land for places for people to work, so we can have local jobs and people don't have to commute. And anytime we start allocating more land towards parking, we're taking away from that land we can use from places for people to live or places for people to work. So that transit really does help alleviate some of those issues. It creates an alternative to having to have parking everywhere. And so, by focusing on the traffic, I think we're missing the fact that creating some density can allow us to support that transit and then create some alternatives to our current kind of expectation for how we get around town.
Yeah, and probably we should have a whole other podcast series on parking, because it is
Absolutely.
like
That's a whole nother
that
topic.
is a whole other topic, and we could spend a lot of time today going into that topic and whether we need more parking or less parking. And there are fierce advocates on both sides, not only in Squamish but in cities all over the world. And there are some dramatic changes going on with parking in other parts of the world. So it's certainly something that I keep my eye on, and I know council does too. But where I want to go with this idea of traffic is that our sort of more established neighborhoods were designed at a time when the car was king. And when I arrived here, it was so interesting to me that there's all these neighborhoods and no sidewalks. And the idea that kids didn't need sidewalks, to get to school, or there weren't bike lanes everywhere. And it's a very much a car-oriented community that stretches quite far. And so where we're at is that we're trying to now retrofit our neighborhoods for more transit, more active transportation, more pedestrian-friendly streetscapes. And that's certainly not cheap, and it can't happen all at once. And so there is a relationship between development and making that happen. So, like, I'll give an example from where I live. When I moved in, there weren't sidewalks all the way from my house to Brennan Park, but there are now. And I've lived here for 8 years. So it's gradually over time, with the development that's happened along my neighborhood streets. Now my kids can get there safely on a sidewalk, which I love. The other thing that we designated in the official community plan, because we heard people say, I know we're going to grow. Like, I get it. The highway, expansion really changed the accessibility of our community. So I can see that we're going to grow, but I don't want to lose that sense of a small town feel. And so I think that really pushed us in the direction of this idea of neighborhood nodes. So as we get bigger, as we add more people to Squamish, no, we're not going to recognize everyone we see at the post office or at Nestor or Save on Foods, but we can start to have those relationships on a neighborhood level. And so the official community plan, as you know, designates key spots within each major neighborhood, because what we want people to be able to do is be able to walk to meet a lot of their daily needs, like, ooh, ran out of milk. I would love it that people don't have to get in their car. They can send their 10-year-old, down the street, go get me some milk. And they can do that safely and conveniently without getting in a car. So I think these little commercial nodes, places to meet up, have some of your daily needs met right within your neighborhood, whether it's Brackendale or the Highlands or Valleycliff. And we can see those, right? Like we have that little pod in Brackendale, 2 pods actually around Eagle Run and then around the general store. And Valleycliff has one. I know in my own neighborhood in North Yards, we just did a rezoning that establishes a neighborhood node to the east of me. So that will be exciting as that develops. So I think this idea of our relationship with the car needs to change. And while, I also think generally that people here just need to change their driving habits. So, our engineers are always working on better road design and more bike-friendly, pedestrian-friendly road design. And people here just need to slow down and recognize that the same people that are complaining about parking or the speed on streets are the people that are probably doing 55 instead of 50 or 40 through a school zone. Like, we all have to take responsibility for that. And I get great pleasure right now of actually driving the speed limit wherever I go and slowing people down behind me. It's a really effective way to do it. Just takes a few people to drive the actual speed limit, and you make everyone else behind you drive the actual speed limit. And this is a really fun thing for people to do in the school zones from 7:30 in the morning till 7:30 at night, is to make people drive 30 kilometers an hour. And we all have the power to do that. So I'm empowering anyone who listens to this to just drive the speed limit, and we will slow a lot of people down just through our own actions. So anyway, and one of the great places you'll see this idea of a neighborhood node build out very quickly is downtown, because that's where we've really added the most density. And that is like an example of a beautiful walkable neighborhood. Shops, services, recreation. I mean, my goodness, the development on the Mamcomb Blind Channel, there's a little wharf down there. So if you have a kayak or a sup, you can now, leave your condo and carry it down and put it in on the Mamcomb Blind Channel, go for a paddle from your back door. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. The future of downtown is really amenity rich.
Yeah.
Like it's just going to get better and better for those guys downtown, which is really fantastic. But I do think those neighborhood nodes are also really appealing. And the idea of being able to wander out, there's the go get your thing of milk or some eggs. That's great. But I think even probably more exciting in my mind is like like a little vibrant area where there's a couple restaurants and a cafe, right? That becomes a bit of a meeting point, a social point. It adds richness without having to jump in the car and drive away. Or if you're in one of the many places that you can bike from your home, you can grab something on the way out or on the way back if you're going on a ride on our trail network. So yeah, there's a lot of appeal of that neighborhood node. And I think, again, as part of the density piece, we're working towards that, and it just takes time. It's an iterative process where we get further and further along that road.
You often hear people refer to, maybe you've referred to it, Squamish, as this, is like we're in our awkward teenage years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like we were one thing and we're becoming something else, but there's this whole time period where it's evolving and it's not there yet.
Yeah, and it's on a bunch of different fronts, but the some of the stuff we're talking about now, like transportation, is very much in that category. Yeah. One of the concerns in the community around restricting single family units, and I think this is one that we hear quite passionately, in some of these conversations, is that restricting single family units or shifting our approach for how new land is used. Not so much restricting single family, because I think there's a place for single family in new developments, but we're looking to include more variety, more diversity of housing forms, which means not all of it will be single family. And so one of the concerns we hear is that by increasing some forms but reducing the single family proportion, that's going to drive up the prices of single family units and make them unaffordable. That those choices to try and support townhouses or plexes in our new areas or in redevelopment is really going to make it more expensive for people who want to get into a single family home. What's your take on that? How does density impact affordability?
Matt, like from the minute I was elected on the council in 2014, I continue my learning in this regard and listen hard to the debates on both sides of this, that, supply is the answer. Just create more supply, more supply, more supply. And the price will come down. And then other people on the other side of the debate that are like, we can't keep up in terms of just building single family. So I want people to hear, I have nothing against a single family home, and I'm perfectly happy for it to appear in our sub area planning. But if we build only single family homes, and this is the other side of the argument, is that we can't keep up with the infrastructure costs to service those lower density neighborhoods. We can't put effective transit in there because we don't have the tax base to support a 15-minute service. The environmental cost, and then the loss of opportunity to build affordable homes is lost because it's very difficult to build a affordable single family home and protect it in perpetuity. There are ways to do it, but by just giving over land to a single family home development, we miss out on those. So there's a couple of things that I think about when I think about, what if we just opened up supply and just provided more and more land for this type of housing? So one, I think the demand is insatiable. Like, we will never fill it up. It's like feeding a teenager. They'll just keep eating if there's food around. And I feel like that's the same. We sit, a convenient 45 minutes from a major metropolitan area where housing is, well, I would say our housing is almost as expensive as there now. But yeah, people like the lifestyle up here. And we've seen that through the pandemic, our single family home demand has increased as people are like, why am I in the city when I could be working from home up in Squamish and biking from my backyard or paddleboarding or what have you? So I don't think we ever meet the demand. Urbanism is a thing. We'll have more people over time migrating towards cities, population increase. And I think we won't be able to keep up. Doesn't matter how much land I give over. And I'm not sure it would drop the prices substantially. I think the demand would outstrip supply. I think also developers are really good at putting homes onto the market at a pace that makes sure they get the best possible price. Like, I haven't seen anyone market, all the homes all at once. They do it in phases. For that purpose, is to make sure the demand is always higher than the supply, and so that it is a seller's market. So, we can't get away from that. Like, I hear developers telling me supply, 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 and I say back to them, well, I don't see you putting 200 homes on the market at the same time. Like, you don't do that to drop the price. So it is, I think, a bit of a catch-22. But what I don't want to see us do is miss out on the opportunity to build complete neighborhoods with neighborhood nodes where people can gather, with parks, with childcare, with daily amenities close by, and putting some single family lots in that mix, I think is a great idea. But also duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, row houses. That's a form of housing that we haven't even explored, right? Is the ownership in row houses rather than strata. Like, there's so many things we could be doing that we're not doing yet. We're starting to see cottage clusters coming into the mix, which is fantastic, like a smaller form of housing, but it's still, your four walls. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. without sacrificing some of the things that people care about, which is like ground oriented living and a connection to a yard or a space, right?
Yeah, one thing I think about in this conversation is that really through the official community plan and that engagement process, people told us that they wanted us to maintain the green space, which is why we came up with a growth management boundary. We're trying to constrain how much land we consume because we want to preserve the environment. We want to conserve our recreation assets, our trail network. We don't want to sprawl. And so once you do that, there is a certain amount of land that we want to use for housing. And just as you're saying, we could do a Hail Mary pass and say let's chop it all up into single family and try and sell that and see if we can bring down the housing values for single family homes. But we're next to 2.5 million people in the Lower Mainland. A lot of them are looking for opportunities to move to a place like Squamish, and if we consume all that land, using it to create single family, maybe we change the price just a bit, right? And so instead of being 1.8 million, it's maybe 1.6. Maybe we can bring down the price a little bit, but that price change isn't going to be so much that it's going to make the average family in Squamish able to purchase those homes. The price is so high already. And in doing that, we will consume all our land that we could use to create more affordable housing through other housing products, as you're saying. And I think that's really the key, that we need to start shifting our expectations that those single family homes are very expensive and it's going to be very hard for a lot of people to get them. And if we want to create housing that's more expensive or less expensive, we need to create housing forms that are smaller, that share space, but still provide a good lifestyle and a great community. And I think one thing to talk about, which you talked about briefly, is the proportion of single family homes in Squamish. Single detached makes up 46% of occupied dwelling units, or 44% if you look at all the dwelling units in our community. And that's really high for the corridor. In Pemberton, 30% of all dwelling units are single detached. And in Whistler, 13% are single detached.
Right. That's amazing to me.
It's amazing. And that's out of the 2016 census. It means that there's a lot of space for us to create multifamily and still have a healthy population of single family units in our community. We can create multifamily for a long time and still have quite a high proportion for the community we're in. So I think when I look at it in that way, I feel like we've got to be really strategic about how we use these remaining lands. If we want to hang on to our green space around our community, then we really have to try and create diversity and variety of housing forms in the land that remains to be developed.
Yeah. And you know what, for me, Matt, like people talk about, is Squamish going to be a bedroom community of the Lower Mainland? Is it already a bedroom community of the Lower? I don't think it's a bedroom community of the Lower Mainland. I think it has its own identity and its sense of place still. But we need to protect that, which means we need to have land available for jobs as well as for people to live in, which you already talked about. But also, we need to be able to have people live here that provide all of the things we need, right? So that new teachers can start their careers here, paramedics, firefighters, police officers, mechanics, people that, through this pandemic, we realized are essential workers, and we can't live without them. They need to be able to afford homes here. And so my worry is if we focus too much on sort of this idea that single family is the be all and end all, is that we miss the opportunity to keep essential workers here, nurses, teachers. Those folks have to be able to see that they can, our young folks could go away, get an education, come back and find a home here and raise their family here. And it may not be a single family home, but it's a great home in a great neighborhood with a ton of amenities and great transit, and places to meet up with your neighbors and connect. So I think about that too, is making sure that people stay here that really run this town. It's not me. Like, I could leave, no one's going to miss me, but we are going to miss those folks that keep our town going. And that goes for the folks that work at the district, right? Like our public works staff and our rec services staff. Like, those are the people. We don't want them commuting from somewhere else. They need to be able to live here and work here. So
Yeah.
that's very much on my mind.
Yeah. And families.
Yeah.
Families that are trying to raise children, have to pay childcare costs, and our kids. my kids, like if they want to move into this market, if it's all single family homes that cost $2 million, that's a pretty tough barrier to entry
Yeah.
to keep youth around. So I think that's a great transition. We've talked about a lot of the aspects related to density and livability and some of the tensions that exist. But on a more personal level, let's talk a bit about our own experiences and how they relate to housing. Um, for you, what's your relationship to single family homes and multifamily housing?
Ooh, I think I grew up in single family homes. And I think in my head, that was always sort of where I was going, right? Like once I had a family, I'd be in a single family home. And then I spent a few years in Vancouver after Sean and I were just married. And we had this amazing little apartment right near Granville Island. And we didn't own a car. We walked to everything, or took the bus or rode our bikes. And it was awesome. We eventually did buy a car because I got a job quite far away from where I lived, which wasn't ideal. But still, a few days a week, I would try and bike out there. But in 2006, we moved down to Australia. We moved to Melbourne, which is a huge city, 3.5 million people. We still don't have kids yet, but suddenly, we were inner city, and living in a neighborhood called North Melbourne, which is interesting. Now I live in North Yards, so there might be like a theme in my head.
Going north.
But something that Melbourne's done really, really well in some of its inner suburbs is that they kept their little high street, right? So created and maintained these walkable neighborhoods. So there's townhomes, there's row houses, there's a few single family homes in the mix, there's a few apartment buildings, but I could walk to a little grocery store. Like I couldn't do my big shops there. I could walk to the Vic Market, so a farmer's market. I had my favorite coffee shop. The pharmacy was there. It was all within walking distance. So when I walked into the coffee shop, they would see me, after a few months, and they would start making my coffee without having to order.
Nice. That's great.
When I went into the pharmacy, they knew my name, they knew my kids, as they were coming along, and they would ask me stuff, like, oh, how's your daughter? Is your daughter over her ear infection? Or, is she walking yet? And all those sorts of things. Like people have a sense of that you belong there. You were part of that neighborhood. You were a local and you were a regular. And that happened in both the neighborhoods we lived in while we were in Melbourne. And so when we came to Squamish, we moved back to Canada. We live in a multifamily development. And one of the things I love about it is that, one, I don't have to do yard work. But two, I have a neighborhood, right? And I have a sense of belonging and people looking out for each other. I love that I can now walk to a few really important things like beer and bread and some of the activities that my family loves to do. We're really close to the river, so we can feel like we're in nature very quickly. My partner can mountain bike from the door to wherever trail he wants to get to. So it's that sense, like, so now I don't really aspire to that single family home. I aspire to livable and green space. Like those things are important to me. It's not having the fence and my own yard. But do I feel connected to my neighbors? Can I walk or access services close to me in a really easy way? Do I feel part of a neighborhood? And so I think Melbourne really helped me see that I didn't need to live in a single family home to feel like I had the space I needed to raise my family and be part of civic life. Like it was a really wonderful experience. So I think that's what I imagine for Squamish in the future, is just amazing neighborhoods with these services close by and that deep sense of community connection with people in your neighborhood, and the shopkeepers that will see you as a regular and know things about you and welcome you. So I think that kind of, for me, is where I sit on the whole spectrum. What about you?
Yeah, and yeah. Oh, just before that, I think one of the things that you're speaking to addresses something I hear about Squamish on occasion. People talk about how, Squamish is great, but actually you got to drive everywhere. And I think that speaks to these neighborhoods that don't have services. And I think you're highlighting something that you lose when those neighborhoods don't have that hub that has somewhere you can go to run into people, or fill some of your needs, or have a shop that recognizes you. We lose that by not having that density. And I think that's something that a lot of these policies are trying to address. But for me, I moved to Squamish 6 years ago. And when we came here, we were pretty keen to purchase a home. We thought we'd be staying for the long haul. And when we started looking around the community to try and decide what part of town we wanted to live in, we settled on a couple areas, primarily because of the access to the trail network. I really wanted to have that proximity, which I think you hear a lot of.
Absolutely.
People want to be close to trails. It's one of our like great assets here. We have these neighborhoods where you get on your bike, and literally like within a couple minutes, I'm on world-class trails to bike around on. So we identified some places we wanted to live, but one of the things that I was struck by when I looked at the housing in those areas was that there wasn't housing variety in there, housing diversity. There were single family neighborhoods. And so ultimately we purchased a single family home. That was the choice that was available for these places. And I noticed, it's interesting, some of the things that you've noted are some of the things that I see as downsides. Like I hate doing yard work, and my neighbors probably notice it, but I'm not, I would like to go out on a walk with my kids, or I would like to go into the mountains, or I'd like to get on my bike.
Absolutely.
Yet doing work on the yard is not one of those high priority items for me. And so, the idea of a strata where that's taken care of and you're sharing the cost of that really appeals to me. And then another piece that I think about a lot, and maybe it's my land use kind of planner hat coming through, but I look at the backyards of my home and my adjacent neighbors, and I see all this green space that's cut up into these tiny little squares that really, like, if I go out and take a look, there's almost nobody out there. Occasionally there's kids in we'll go out and jump on the trampoline and do that kind of thing, but the use is really low. I go to some other friends' places, like some friends that live in Amelpath or in Shannon Estates, where they have these large green spaces that have either trails or some kind of infrastructure, a playground that activates that area. And the kids can run out the back door into that space and have all their buddies out there in this great green space that they're interacting with. The parents can hang out there and chit chat while the kids are playing, or maybe the kids are out there on their own. Like, that really appeals to me. And I see our division of that space into these private little spaces really inefficient, and a really poor use of that space. And so I think, oh man, could we just blow out these fences and like make this one giant space with somebody to come and cut that grass and put a playground in there? That just sounds fantastic.
Right. Maybe you should pitch this idea to your neighbors, Matt.
Yeah, I
Don't
don't
go
know
and
how it'd
start
go
cutting down their
over.
fences without their permission.
I have a feeling it might fly. I might not fly quite yet, but so I feel like we should make sure that all these different parts of our community have these various forms of housing in. And I think people are really used to expecting that specific neighborhoods have a specific character and are, for example, a single family neighborhood. I think people have gotten attached to that and used to that. But I think there's actually quite an equity issue when you think about that there are people that are never going to put the money into a house. Maybe they can't, or maybe they choose not to, but for them to be excluded from a part of our community because of that cost or those choices isn't equitable. And so I think we owe it to our community to have a variety of options throughout the entire community. And then when I think about my kids, I would love them to be able to live as close to the trails as I live when they decide to live somewhere. But with the way housing prices are going in comparison to wages, that could be pretty hard for a lot of our kids. And do we want to have what we want, like a single family neighborhood, for example, for those people that want that, at the cost of our children being able to have an option to live in whatever neighborhood they want? I think there's an equity issue there as well, and intergenerational. And so I think we've got to start planning for that and make some choices to provide that kind of diversity.
Yeah, I think it's such an important question for our community to ask itself, is that idea of equity and who gets to live where and at what age and at what income. And I guess people might differ on that philosophically, but I think if you've spent most of your life in a neighborhood that you love, just because you retire or now you're on a fixed income or a pension, why do you have to move?
Yeah, totally.
Why can't you get a great little cottage or a little apartment in the neighborhood that you love and where you have connection and where you have community? Why should it force you to move? Or, or if you have a career shift and your income's dropped, but you still want to stay in your community, but you need to downsize, why should we force you to move to a community again where you don't have connection and contacts? But why not say, yeah, for a few years, I'm gonna live in this condo until I get back up on my feet, or in this townhouse, or, I think we should look at it as all forms of housing are great forms of housing. There's not one that's better. What we need to create is livable and sustainable neighborhoods and communities. And that to me is the bigger picture, is people being outside, being with others, being in community, pandemic notwithstanding. Right? So
Yeah, for sure.
it's that big picture of how what creates a great community. And I hope that conversation with our community continues at every opportunity. It's such a fascinating conversation to have.
Absolutely. One thing that actually just made me think of was that when you're talking about living in a neighborhood over your lifespan through different phases of your life, when you layer that on with that comment you mentioned earlier, where people wanted to not lose that small town vibe that Squamish had, those neighborhood nodes become more important, because that becomes that area where you create
Totally.
within the bigger community your connections to a group of people that you live around. And so if you can't maintain your place in a neighborhood because the housing isn't available to suit your stage of life, then you aren't going to maintain that small town feel. You're going to end up in another place which you don't have the connections to over time. So it again creates that importance for having that density to support those nodes, to support that commercial, to support that gathering space, and those variety of housing forms over time.
Absolutely. This has been a really interesting conversation, Matt. And you know what? I know it's not the end
Yeah.
of it either. Hopefully, what we've done is stimulate some thinking out there, and I know the feedback will keep coming to us on council and to you as staff. But I hope at least our conversation has helped to broaden people's thinking on this topic, and away from the density is just always bad or density is always good. I know there's trade-offs for sure, for
Absolutely.
people on both sides of this discussion. But anyway, hopefully we've helped to at least expand people's thinking on this topic.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point to end the conversation for now.
All right. Thanks, Matt.
All right. Thank you, Mayor Elliott.